overwhelmed and were forced to draw off the top of the mountain down into the valley beyond.
Franklin's troops, too exhausted to pursue, come up the road and spend the night in the gap and along these mountain roads. It is the Confederate withdrawal up and into Crampton's Gap that serves as the basis for our first South Mountain legend. The legend of Spook Hill tells the story of the Confederate artillerymen who valiantly tried to save their guns during the Union charge up the mountainside. As the Union soldiers charged towards them, the Confederate soldiers manning the guns tried desperately to push their cannons up the side of the mountain. But as the Confederates pushed the guns upward, they were either shot or had to abandon the guns to save their own lives. This caused the cannons to roll back down the hill, killing the other Confederate soldiers, who were also fleeing for their lives below. It is believed by local residents that these poor Confederate souls never left the battlefield that day. Today, the area is quiet. The sounds of cannons aren't even a memory anymore. The entire area shows virtually no signs of the Battle of South Mountain, except for an occasional sign along the road. But there is one spot along the Gapland Road that may still hold the memories of the actions that took place that afternoon. It is said that if you stop your car at a certain spot along Gapland Road next to the battlefield, place it in neutral, you'll begin to drift uphill. People speculate that it's those Confederate soldiers that are pushing vehicles back up the mountain. They are forever charged with the task of pushing the cannons back up the mountain to Crampton's Gap and away from the advancing Federals. Some say the legend isn't true, that the portion of Gapland Road is just an optical illusion. They claim that the road in fact slopes downwards, not upwards. It's just a simple trick of optics. But some tell an entirely different legend altogether.
The legend that I know of surrounding Burkittsville was that after the battle, a wagon load of wounded, evidently without horse teams attached, was left on a piece of the road which looked evidently to be level or slightly tilted in one direction, but in fact it was an optical illusion sort of thing. We're actually tilted in the other, and so when they unhitched the teams and just left the wagon sitting, it moved in a direction that appeared to many people to be rolling uphill, and that this was a phenomena that many people took as some sort of sign. And so the legend was that in modern times people would drive their automobiles to this spot and take them out of gear and release emergency brake, and the car would likewise appear to roll uphill, and people began to make some sort of conclusion that this had something to do with the spiritual world and not physics.
The legend, as I heard it, was that prior to the Battle of South Mountain, or just as the battle was beginning, a Confederate artillery group was trying to push one of their artillery pieces up the road towards the mountain to get it up on top ready for action. When a Federal artillery shell landed on the crew, killing them all instantly. The legend then is that even to today, that same group of men are trying to push that cannon to the top of the mountain, which is why you can take your car down there, put it in neutral, and it starts to roll backwards up the mountain.
Is it simple physics? Does the road actually slope downhill? Maybe. Then again, yet maybe something else entirely different is happening along that stretch of Gapland Road. In our last Legends program, we brought you the story of an old farmer who lived here at Fox's Gap by the name of Daniel Wise. As the legend goes, Old Man Wise was contracted by the Union Army to help bury the dead on his land after the Battle of South Mountain. The fighting at Fox's Gap was some of the fiercest of all the fighting that September day, and it lasted the longest.
The combat at Fox's Gap started around 9 in the morning and lasted until well after dark. The combat started between 3,000 Ohio troops under the command of General Jacob D. Cox and 1,000 North Carolinians under the command of Brigadier General Samuel Garland.
Around about 10:30 in the morning, Samuel Garland, a Confederate general, was mortally wounded on the field. At that point, of course, Confederate resistance started to dissolve, and the Federals were able to push the Confederates through the gap and actually controlled the gap by around noon.
They held their ground for almost 2 hours. And it was one of the few instances in the war where there was actually hand-to-hand combat. It got that fierce. Usually in the Civil War, when the two armies would come together, the sheer terror of the firepower, the charges would just peter out before there was physical contact. But there was about a 15 to 20 minute period around mid-morning when it actually got to club muskets and bayonet wounds.
It was during the fierce morning fighting that Confederate General Samuel Garland was mortally wounded and taken to the old South Mountain Inn, or as it was known then, the Mountain House.
Eventually, the North Carolinians, for the most part, were driven down the west face of the mountain, and Cox's Ohioans had actually won the crest. But now the Union Army was suffering under the misconception that the Confederates were a much larger force and there was a Johnny behind every tree.
These tactics were enough to stall the Union Army to wait until reinforcements arrived to renew the fighting.
What these rebels did, they called bushwhacking. They would hide behind a fence, jump up and shoot, duck down, run to another place, jump up and shoot. And they were all over Fox's Gap, and it gave General Cox the impression that there was a much larger force. And so he decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he would wait for reinforcements. He pulled back. Anderson's men continued their bushwhacking, and sort of a lull sets in around midday. Now, as the day progresses, more Union troops start showing up from the direction of Frederick. And we're talking about the Union 9th Corps under the overall command of General Ambrose Burnside. The Corps commander is General Jesse Lee Reno. Troops of the 9th Corps start showing up and start supporting Cox's position, getting ready for a general advance around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. On the Confederate side, Longstreet's troops start arriving from Hagerstown. There's a bit of an irony with the Battle of South Mountain. Many of the Union soldiers started their march some 12 miles to the east in Frederick, while many of the Confederates started their